Welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast. My name is Anthony Oliver, and today we are talking about the evolving challenges of managing infrastructure investment risk in a rapidly changing world. As systemic threats like climate change, population growth and social inequality intensify, infrastructure funding models centred on individual assets, on clearly defined risks and on relatively predictable climate conditions are reaching their limit. In short, if we are to continue to attract private sector cash to underpin investment in our vital public assets, we need new thinking. Well, my guest today is doing that thinking and helping to take the necessary action. Donna Lopata is Senior Manager for Corporate Engagement at Sydney-based investor group on climate change and has just been working with the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney, on some groundbreaking research into systems stewardship, a radical new way for infrastructure investors to approach the management of risk in this changing world. Donna's work caught my attention at the recent Transforming Infrastructure Performance Summit in Melbourne. In her presentation, she pointed out that the Australian infrastructure investment industry is waking up to a stark reality. If the overarching economic and environmental systems fail, no individual portfolio is safe. However, the IGCC's report suggests that a fundamental shift is already underway. Yet, while some 85% of investment professionals now apply system thinking, a significant implementation gap remains, hampering the transition from high-level belief statements to concrete action. So, bridging this gap requires rethinking everything from procurement and carbon assessment to the very fundamentals of assessing risk. It's a complex and a challenging topic, so let's hear more. Donna, welcome to the Infrastructure Podcast.
Thank you, Anthony. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me on the show.
Well, as I said, in your presentation at the recent TIP Melbourne event, you pointed out that the risks facing infrastructure investors are changing rapidly, prompting much bigger questions about how procurement is structured, how embodied carbon is assessed, and how private-public partnerships are designed. I mean, you say when it comes to managing investor risk, the solution is system stewardship. So, Donna, in your words, what is this? How has it fundamentally changed the way investors approach the market?
Right. Well, what I'd say is when we think about investors, we often think about returns and growing savings over time. But there's another side to that job that matters just as much, and that's managing risk. Because if risks aren't managed, then long-term returns can suffer. And one of the biggest financial risks today is climate risk. So in a scenario where warming is 3 degrees, which unfortunately is a very real possibility, retirement savings could take a serious hit. Some estimates say that returns could be almost 40% lower by 2050, which is, of course, a huge impact. And I think when it becomes really concerning is when you think about the timeframes and the fact that the youngest pension savers today are unlikely to retire until about 2080, which may sound distant, yeah, but this is an issue that's already directly affecting their financial future. And that's why investors are taking action. So with that, one way that they're doing it is by working with the companies they invest in and pushing them to cut emissions and plan for a low carbon future. And that approach is working. Investor groups have already helped to drive more credible transition plans from some of the heaviest emitting companies. But there's an issue, and that is that some of the remaining decarbonisation challenges are complex. And they can't really be changed by individual companies acting alone. And so that's where a shift is happening. And on those issues, investors are having to move beyond dialogue with individual companies and start to focus on the system as a whole. So effectively what that means is supporting better policy and regulation, investing in clean technology and infrastructure, and just really tackling barriers that no single company could solve alone. And that's systems stewardship, which at its core is really about recognising that returns depend on the strength of the economy and on the health of the natural systems that are underpinning it. So energy systems, supply chains, financial markets, and the real economy are all interconnected. And in the end, this is about protecting long-term value.
Right, yeah.
Because climate risk isn't separate from delivering returns. It's essential to it. And so for millions of people that rely on those retirement savings, that work's incredibly important.
Yeah. So, and whether that investment's in a transport system or an energy system or a housing development, the issues are the same.
Exactly.
You've got to
Yes.
think of these things as a system, yeah. You're based in Sydney, Australia, where the IGCC has been shaping the landscape, I think, since 2005. It's a global issue you're dealing with there, but tell us about the organisation and how its mission has evolved from a simple climate advocacy to this more complex, interconnected systems, more systemic approach.
Right. So IGCC is now 20 years old. So when we began in 2005, climate change was actually still being debated. So
Right.
we've come a really long way.
Some would say it's still being debated in some parts of the world, to be honest, Donna.
Fair. But at that time in Australia, there was a small group of investors and they saw that real financial risk. And they also realised they were strongly exposed to high emitting sectors and that would affect long-term returns. So they began to push and they made the case to investors and they made the case to government. And slowly that conversation shifted. What an interesting development was that by 2010, some of the most senior voices in finance in Australia issued a public statement on the financial risks of climate change. And 1 year later, Australia introduced a carbon price. Unfortunately, it was only in place for 2 years, and we've had a lot of, let's call it, policy whiplash on climate change. But through all of that, IGCC has stayed focused and consistent on the main point that this isn't politics, this is investment risk. Right. And that perspective was increasingly recognised worldwide, and very much a champion of that is Mark Carney, who at that time was the governor of the Bank of England, who warned that climate change was a threat to financial stability. And his voice was really significant. So investors began to act, and in 2017, the Investor Group on Climate Change helped as a founding partner to launch Climate Action 100+. So that's the world's largest investor-led climate initiative. Our vision is for a climate resilient economy. So net zero by 2050 and on track this decade, because we know that the next few years are critical. I guess the main point is that this isn't a distant problem. This isn't about tweaking portfolios just at the margins, because climate risk is systemic. So investors can't diversify it away, and portfolios can't be decarbonised in isolation. This is about shifting the whole system, because unfortunately you can't decarbonise an economy one company at a time. Everything has to move.
Well, that's the point you made in Melbourne in February, was that no single organisation can tackle these escalating risks alone. In a competitive market, you need that unified investor voice. Why is now the moment that it becomes this financial necessity rather than just a moral case?
Look, I think we are at a point where we realise that we don't want to stall momentum, and we need to find ways to get investors to act on climate risk in their decisions, to push for policy and regulatory settings in unlocking progress. In Australia, we have over 100 members, many of the largest pension funds and asset managers in Australia and New Zealand. And together they manage nearly $5 trillion locally and around $40 trillion globally. So it's not just capital, it's real influence, but it needs to be addressed now, because in a context where, as I mentioned earlier, you could find a 3-degree warming scenario with returns diminished by 40%, that's a huge risk.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the report, which offers some solutions and some recommendations, which they're applicable in Australia, but they're also applicable globally. Systems Stewardship, Managing Interconnected Climate Risk for Lasting Value. You published late last year and was authored by Alison Atherton at the Institute for Sustainable Futures at the University of Technology, Sydney. What was the goal of the report then?
Yeah, well, we were starting to have conversations with our members about system stewardship. But what became clear was that people were interpreting it in very different ways, and what it meant, what it involved, and how you actually put it into practice. So we wanted to take a step back. We wanted to understand those differences and try and turn system stewardship from a buzzword into something concrete to guide real decisions and real action, which in my opinion is the next step. What I would clarify though is that investors have already made strong progress engaging with companies. So this is an evolution of that. Now it's about working together to take a more coordinated system-wide approach to tackle barriers and climate risk is becoming more urgent and more complex. So that's the only way to do it.
Yeah. Well, it's a way of, I suppose, of formalising quite a lot of work and a lot of thinking that was already happening, presumably.
Yes.
I mean, now was the right moment, but simply because the data is showing that we have to act now.
Absolutely. This is the decisive decade.
Mm-hmm. The report focuses, as I say, on the Australian market. How are you seeing this work being picked up by the rest of the world?
I think they're global lessons because climate risk doesn't fit neatly inside a border. Emissions don't obey borders, and neither do investment portfolios. Australian institutional investors do have a home bias in their portfolios, but most are very global investors. And many of our largest funds have teams working offshore, including in the UK. But the findings in the report are really applicable to other markets. So you mentioned earlier that around 85% of investors are already starting to bring systems thinking into their approach, and they're thinking about big interconnected risks like climate change and biodiversity loss and social inequality. And all of those are material to long-term returns. And the main way that investors are acting is collaboratively through involvement in initiatives like Climate Action 100+, and also with engagement with governments on policy and regulation. But investors are now beginning to engage not just with companies, but across sectors and value chain. And the report gave an example of that, 2025, so last year, an investor-led initiative by Fidelity International, as well as global asset owners that were targeting methane emissions in the steel supply chain. And their motivation there is that methane from metallurgical coal has a really potent near-term climate impact and will be affected by regulations. So to future-proof steel investment, they need to act. But what I would say is that investors interviewed in the report were pretty candid about some of the challenges. Right. They talked about the time and the resources needed for meaningful dialogue with companies, and particularly in a context where they have limited resources. And they also said that at times, teams are not always aligned internally. And then perhaps one of the biggest issues is that incentives still reward short-term performance over long-term outcomes. And short-term metrics, they're really deeply embedded in how institutional investing works. So that makes it a bit harder.
Yeah, well, so is this report therefore, is it a how-to guide for ESG specialists, or is it a wake-up call for the chief investment officer or the board of trustees? Where is it pitched? Which level of the organisation do you think it's going to get into?
Look, in the first instance, I'd say it's a wake-up call. I think for CIOs and boards, it highlights just how significant and interconnected climate risks have become. But for them and for ESG teams, it also points to what needs to happen next.
Yeah, it's an interesting one because we're taking the Transforming Infrastructure Performance Summit to New York next month. And clearly there's a difference in political approach when it comes to climate risk in the States compared to Australia and Europe. Are you seeing that in your research? Because it's a global issue, but politically there are different ways of addressing it.
Very much. It's a very significant challenge. That's right.
Well, let's talk about you for a moment, Donna, because you've been with the IGC since February last year and pivoted your career 5 years ago towards sustainable strategies when you took on a PhD at the University of Technology, Sydney in 2021. What prompted the move for you towards this career, really focusing on the challenges of sustainability?
All right. Well, I actually came into this a little bit sideways. I retrained in a Masters of Finance and ended up at Morningstar in their managed funds team. It was a great job. I got to sit across the table from some of the biggest portfolio managers and talk to them about how they invest and what's really driving their decisions. And at the same time, I was focusing on ESG funds. And honestly, they didn't quite stack up.
Right.
And the labels sounded good. But when you look deeper, they often weren't as aligned as you'd expect.
So the fund managers you were working, you could see in real time that they just weren't investing for what you consider to be the right reasons.
Exactly.
But right in inverted commas.
Exactly, yes. So at that time, I wrote a paper on carbon risk in managed funds. And I'd say that was a bit of a light bulb moment for me. It kind of showed me the scale of the issue and made me realise how much more research was needed. So I thought, okay, I need to go deeper, and that's what led me to do a PhD. And my focus was on one main question, which is how will Australian super funds, which are pension funds, actually get to net zero? And the answer wasn't comfortable. The answer was, under the current settings, most portfolios just won't get there, not in a way that aligns with the Paris Agreement, which means something needs to change. Like, we need to be more ambitious, or we need to create the right incentives, and we need to change the system around investors and not just expect them to act differently. But
interestingly, but not for any altruistic reason, but for the reason primarily, well, one of the reasons is because, as you said at the top, the potential returns are just not going to be there.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So, but look, I'm excited.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
You're right. But I'm really glad now to be at IGCC, and what I'm doing now is actually putting my research into action.
Yeah. Well, your career before that was in architecture and interior design. I mean, that's quite a shift from architecture and interior design to finance and now advocacy and sustainability and carbon reduction. Do you miss the creative industries?
Well, I'm not using many of my drawing skills much these days, so I do miss that. But funnily enough, a lot of the thinking actually carries over. So in my design projects, I incorporated passive design principles. And I was thinking about embodied carbon in materials, and I was thinking about the product life cycle. So the sustainability mindset was there even at that point.
Right.
And the other thing is that the people side hasn't changed either. Communication, persuasion, bringing other people with you. That's the same thing I do today.
Yeah. Well, you're based in Sydney. You've got a family. I think you've got 3 kids. Is that right?
That's right. Yes.
Three kids and a husband. Are you? What do you get up to in Sydney? There. How do you spend your downtime?
Sydney is a gorgeous place to be outdoors. My favourite thing is to be in the sunshine, especially at the beach, with a good book in my hand.
Well, I'm sure that as the winter draws near to you, then I'm sure that you'll have some plenty of reflecting to do on that. But is it a good place to be a champion for sustainable strategies?
I think it is. Yeah, I'd say so for a few reasons. First of all, I'd say Australia's a pretty small but collaborative market. And I think there's a real willingness from investors and from companies to really work together, which makes a big difference when you're trying to drive change. Secondly, we've got a government that's legislated net zero and is broadly supportive of the climate transition. So that creates a clearer direction of travel. And thirdly, and most problematically and importantly, the motivation is real. Australia is very exposed. We're already feeling the impacts of climate change. And if global temperatures rise by just 2 degrees, sea levels could rise by 30 centimetres, and then coastlines could retreat by 300 metres. And when you think that most Australians live near the coast, the scale of that impact is huge.
I mean, spending great times on some lovely beaches there is, I suppose, is one thing, but it also, being in Australia, does bring you very, very up close to the impacts of climate change, because there's some very, very vulnerable communities there.
It does. Yes, that's right.
At IGCC, you got very strong links with the University of Technology, Sydney, which, of course, is where you did your PhD. And you, I believe, gained your PhD last year. So you now are the doctor. Congratulations.
Thanks.
What attracted you to that university then? And what makes it a great partner for you now at IGCC?
Well, what I really love about the Institute for Sustainable Futures, I'll call them ISF, at the University of Technology, Sydney, is that it sits somewhere between being a university and a consultancy. So you've got academic rigour, but it's also really applied. And it's really focused on real-world outcomes. It's incredibly interdisciplinary. There's expertise across a number of areas: economics, climate resilience, energy, food systems, but all coming together in one place. Mm-hmm. While I was studying, I was working with ISF's business and economy team, and I still have an affiliation with them now. It was a really inspiring environment to be part of. And so when we commissioned the report, we went through a proper competitive tender process, but in the end, it's not surprising that ISF came out on top because this is their niche and they were best placed to deliver the work.
Yeah. I'm sure that there'll be lots of people in the UK who are trying to find a bit more about the university and how they can maybe spend a few winters over there, maybe. Who knows? Anyway, back...
Good plan, yeah.
Good plan. Back to the report then. I mean, as I said, and as you said, it suggests that 85% of professionals apply system thinking, but almost none link it to, for instance, issues such as executive pay. So, I mean, is systems stewardship currently just a philosophy, I suppose, rather than an actual practice?
That's exactly what we wanted to unpack in the report.
Right.
A lot of people say they're using systems thinking, but we wanted to understand what that actually looks like in practice. And the honest answer is we're still at a very early stage. And some parts are relatively easy to adopt and others are much harder because the system that investors operate in is still built around the short term. You see it everywhere. Quarterly earnings, exec pay, benchmark performance, investment mandates, even the way that asset managers and consultants are assessed. And it's not just markets. You see it in political cycles, in how long leaders stay in their roles. And all of that, it really reinforces short-term thinking. And that sits in direct tension with climate change, which plays out over decades. So that's one of the biggest challenges. And it's going to take real work to shift it. We are starting to see other ways of measuring performance, like a wellbeing framework instead of a GDP measurement. So in New Zealand, for example, environmental outcomes are built into budgeting. So governments could do that. They could even require pension funds to invest in climate-aligned infrastructure. And organisations themselves could start to change incentives, embed KPIs that reward system-level actions, not just short-term returns. So, coming back to your question, it's more than a philosophy. I think it's a practice,
right? But
it's a long journey. And unfortunately, when the urgency of climate change being what it is, I don't think we've got the luxury of taking it slowly.
No, I suppose with infrastructure, its lifespan is over such long periods of time. You'd think that it would be something which would be naturally very well suited to embracing these long-term issues around climate change and sustainability. But I suppose the reality is that we are still locked into these short-term cycles, which is generating results for politicians, generating results for the public, etc., which is a challenge. And I suppose without a universally accepted way to quantify impact, I mean, how do you convince a sceptical board that stewardship activities are actually generating those vital financial revenues and vital financial value, which is also important to the investment community?
That's right. Look, most boards today are looking at climate change through a risk lens. And in Australia, that's a requirement. Regulators expect boards to identify and stress test and quantify the financial risks of climate change. We're also seeing a growing wave of greenwashing litigation. If organisations make net zero commitments, they need to be credible with detailed plans behind them and an intent to deliver it. Otherwise, they've got legal risk. And that extends to superannuation funds as well. But what is financially material and over what time frame? And traditionally, that's assessed over a relatively short investment horizon, which, as I said before, that's not how climate change operates. Mark Carney put this as the tragedy of the horizon, where by the time climate risk shows up clearly in financial stability, it's already too late to act. But the problem, the way I think about it, is that if you stay purely in a risk mindset, your thinking is going to be too narrow. You can't just put this in a risk register. It has to move into strategy because boards are not just there to manage downside. They need to position organisations for the future. And when you're looking at that world where close to 40% of pension returns could be at risk, the question isn't about loss. It's about looking for opportunities to create long-term value. And that's part of properly meeting their fiduciary duty.
Yeah. I suppose what you're saying is trying to reframe this issue. Actually embracing these issues around climate risk are positive things rather than negative issues for investors.
Yes, well said. That's it.
Yeah. Well, recommendations, you've got 6 in the report. and they're pretty clear. Let's look at some of those. One of them is, the first is enhance collaborative engagement to amplify impact. You talk about the need for dedicated resources, moving beyond business as usual. I mean, does this mean the end of small, overstretched stewardship teams and the birth of a new central investment function that deals with these issues?
Well, I think the next phase will look different for every organisation. But one thing is clear. I think there is value in breaking down silos and bringing a systems lens into how organisations operate, because I don't think these challenges fit neatly in one team. They cut across investment and risk and policy and operations. IGCC can really help play a role here in bringing the right people together. They're, the problem owners in a value chain. And work with them to identify the most effective issue-specific solutions and co-design programs that can actually move the needle.
I mean, there's big challenges, I suppose, around, because you're dealing with a lot with people there and people's cultures, etc. Second one is regulatory clarification and modernisation. And I always kind of smile when you have a recommendation to modernise regulations, because there's some challenges around that. But tell us, what specific regulatory changes are needed then to ensure that investors do act in a systemic way?
Yeah, right. Well, the wish list is this. One of the big challenges investors face is policy fragmentation. So on the one hand, Australia's made good progress. We've got a legislated net zero target. We've got prudential guidelines on managing climate risks. We've got new sustainable reporting standards that have just been rolled out. But they don't sit in isolation, and it needs to be aligned with investor and company regulation, because there are other parts of the system pulling in a different direction. We also have regulation like best financial interest duty, which is often interpreted in a really short-term way. We also have an annual performance test for pension funds, and that just reinforces it. So put together, you've got a whole lot of unintended consequences which narrow that opportunity set, and it makes it harder for investors to use patient capital. And that's the kind of long-term capital that's needed to fund climate transition and, as you said, particularly infrastructure projects. So instead of enabling investment in solutions, the regulatory system can end up holding it back.
Big challenges there, I believe. Another recommendation is to align language, incentives and metrics. The call is for a shared vocabulary. What do you mean by that? What's an example of a term or a typology, if standardised, would immediately make collaboration much easier?
Well, I think one of the most important starting points is bringing a systems approach into language and metrics in projects. And systems thinking is great for dealing with complex problems. And things like decarbonising global investment portfolios, that's not simple. The context is large, there's uncertainties, it's constantly changing, and everything's connected. And one of the hardest parts is the uncertainty. So we don't know exactly how fast emissions will fall. That's going to depend on policy and how the private sector responds. And then even with good science, there's still a whole lot of outcomes. Climate risks can have feedback loops in the system. So if permafrost melts and releases large amounts of carbon, and then warming is accelerated further. So those types of tipping points, they're often not captured in climate modelling. So what we need to do is be more flexible, more adaptive, and more comfortable with a degree of uncertainty. We need to take a more iterative approach and test ideas, learn from them, adjust as we go. So for infrastructure projects, it may mean testing assumptions, updating designs, and learning as conditions change. So we need to build a culture where that kind of ongoing learning is encouraged, because that's how you progress a system that's constantly evolving.
Well, getting that culture change is the subject of another one of the recommendations, which is fostering that culture of systems stewardship. I mean, you talk about creating a redesigned reward system. What would that actually look like? I mean, should, for example, a fund manager's bonus be tied to the 10-year decarbonisation of, for instance, the Australian economy? I don't know. What are you specifically talking about then, or thinking about?
Yeah, that may not be a popular view, but it could be the right one, because portfolios don't decarbonise in isolation. Returns do depend on the real economy and the natural systems that support them. But I think it's about shifting mindset it's about the human side. You're not going to feel emotional looking at a spreadsheet. What I think really changes people is lived experiences. I actually had a moment like that where I'd just given a presentation on sea level rise and the risk for small Pacific Island countries like Tuvalu becoming submerged. And as I was leaving, a young woman came up to me and said she was from Tuvalu, and she thanked me for talking about her country. And it was in that moment that I was really struck by her civility and my own discomfort, because I knew that I'm part of the system that's contributing to that outcome. And that moment's...
She's a very real person.
Very real person.
She's a real person you've got.
Exactly. So that moment stayed with me.
Well, I presume that also means developing people who can actually understand and have those conversations with the people who are actually directly affected. I mean, one of the other recommendations you make is around building sector-wide capacity. I mean, do investors now need to hire more communications specialists, lobbyists, political scientists, rather than the traditional analysts they have now?
Yeah, well, a lot of investors, especially global equity managers, have had geopolitical experts in-house for a while. But what we're seeing is a growing role for policy expertise in investment firms, because policy is central to investment outcomes. The other way of thinking about it is IGCC's role, because policy advocacy is one of our core offerings to members, and doing it collaboratively really amplifies the investor voice. For example, last year we led a C-suite delegation to Canberra, pushing for stronger ambition in Australia's next climate targets under the Paris Agreement. That outcome was a 62 to 70% emissions reduction target, but that was consistent with our advice, and importantly, it puts Australia among the most ambitious countries globally.
So, Donna, some very interesting recommendations. What happens next then? You say we need a shift in thinking and practice to prompt bigger questions about how public-private partnerships and procurement are structured. What's the very first thing that you would say a government or a private developer should change in their next major infrastructure bid or procurement process?
I think bids need to demonstrate value over time, not just value for money. How resilient is an asset? How does it perform under climate stress? Does it align with net zero pathways? It'd be really good to see clearer climate requirements baked into tenders, things like sector-specific transition plans or resilience targets or alignment with national climate and adaptation strategies, instead of rewarding lowest upfront cost. And that way procurement can really reward durability and emissions reduction and system-wide benefit. And then on the financing side, more green bonds and blended finance could help governments crowd in private capital more effectively. And that, together with clear policy and clear standards, is also a signal to investors, because what it does is it shifts procurement from short-term delivery to long-term value. Yeah. And that's exactly what I think climate-aligned infrastructure needs.
So if we do successfully transition to this system stewardship model over the next 5 years, 10 years, I mean, what will look different compared to how it does today then?
I think a good outcome would be deeper implementation, capital flowing into climate solutions at scale, not just commitments, but actual deployment into infrastructure, technology and transition pathways. I think it also is about stable, coordinated policy so that investors have the confidence to act long-term and not getting mixed signals. And I think it's a shift in how we measure progress. And that reference I gave earlier about GDPs that look a little bit broader and value well-being or environmental sustainability, like New Zealand's wellbeing budget.
Big opportunities, big challenges. What happens next then? So what happens next? How do you turn your recommendations, your passion, your ambition into real change, Donna?
Well, right now we're focused on two things. Firstly, expanding engagement across value chains, and secondly, building systems literacy across the investment community to find leverage points where our impact can be the greatest. So on value chains this year, we're launching an Asia-Pacific project on methane abatement in mining and oil and gas. And globally, through Climate Action 100+, we're building new research on data centres, given their growing impact on the energy system. And then in terms of Systems Skills will be running a systems mapping workshop in May to help investors better understand how risks connect and how to act on them. Because I think this next phase, it's not about understanding the climate problem. I think it's about acting at scale and with urgency.
Okay, well, certainly I'll put a link in the show notes to the IGCC, and I'm sure all those events, all that activity will be there on your events page. So if people want to pick up some of that, I'm sure they can do. But thanks so much. It's great to catch up again since we last spoke in Melbourne. Really great to dig into the work of the IGCC and the challenges facing the infrastructure investment market in Australia, but also, as we said, globally in this rapidly changing world. Thanks for making time across the time zones for me, and for breaking away from the wonderful beaches of Sydney, I'm sure. So great to see you. Thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Anthony. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Great stuff. Well, sadly, though, that's all we have time for on the podcast today. But there is more in the pipeline as we continue to probe the big issues facing the sector. If you haven't done so already, do check out the Infrastructure Podcast website, www.infrastructure-podcast.com, where you'll find background information and all the latest podcasts to listen to and to share. So thanks for joining us. So thanks again to Donna, and I look forward to seeing you again very soon.